Running and writing tests against a Drupal site with no content is only going to get us so far. There's really not much to do on a Drupal site that doesn't have any content. Eventually, we're going to need to start creating dummy content within the context of our test environment in order to complete our tests. There's another set of really useful helper methods that we haven't looked at yet, which are geared towards creating dummy content for testing, including simple tasks like generating random strings or random names of a specified length, and more complex things like creating nodes. In this lesson, we'll look at the various helpers for creating random content within SimpleTest. Then we'll go ahead and use those tools to test the Drupal core statistics module's functionality by creating a piece of content and viewing it multiple times to ensure the stats counter is appropriately incremented. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the difference between and make use of the random string and random name generators and know how to create dummy content with the Drupal create node helper method. As per usual, I think it probably makes sense for us to start by taking a look at the documentation for the functions that we're going to be talking about in this lesson. So if you go to drupal.org/SimpleTest, you scroll down towards the bottom of the page, we're going to click on the link for testing reference, and then from there we're going to scroll down again and click on the link for API functions. All of these methods and functions are documented on api.drupal.org as well, but I find this reference here to be a little bit easier to understand and really kind of cuts right to the essential parts. So we're going to be talking about the random name, random string, and Drupal create node members of the Drupal web test case. If I scroll down this page a bit, we can find the documentation for those. So we've got Drupal, or this random string, random name, there's a create content type, which we're not going to talk about, but is also useful, and the Drupal create node. All three of these that we're talking about are geared towards allowing us to generate content in order to use with our tests. Sometimes that content is just a random string, like a username. For example, when you do the Drupal create user method, what it's doing in the background is calling Drupal random, or this random name, in order to generate a random username and password as well. There's random string and random name. Both of them return a string of text that's randomized. The difference between the two is that random string will also include non-alphanumeric characters. So special characters like the pound sign or an exclamation or a dollar sign are included in random string, whereas random name is only alphanumeric characters, and it's also guaranteed to always start with an alphabet character, not with a number. This is nice because there are some instances, especially given PHP, where we need strings that we are guaranteed to start with an alphabetical character and not with a number. So understanding that difference is important. Otherwise, they function the same way. You pass in an optional single argument that is the number of characters that you would like to include in that string. The default is 8 for both, but you can make it any number. So we'll look at using those. And then there's the Drupal create node method. The Drupal create node method is used to help us quickly create a node of any particular type. So rather than having to navigate to the node creation form and fill out the form and click the submit button, we kind of manually create a node. We describe the node as an array of key value pairs. Things like node type and title are the keys, and then the values are what we'd like that to be assigned. Then we can use Drupal create node to create that node, and it will actually return the node object for us. You can see a couple examples of this in the documentation here. And also the nice thing is it shows you what the default settings are. So when you call Drupal create node, you can pass in an array of the values that you would like to use when creating that new node. Any that you leave out will default to what you see in the list here. Let's take a look at our code and make use of some of these methods in our test cases. I'm going to switch over to my text editor quick, and I'm going to open up the hello world.test file that we created in previous lessons in this series. This contains all of our tests that we've written so far. You remember in the last lesson we actually added an underscore to a bunch of the test methods. This means that by doing so, the SimpleTest module isn't finding these sets of tests and running them, because they're no longer prefixed with the word test for these methods. What I want to do is find the one where we previously altered the site name. So we did that here in test authorization, actually in the previous lesson. What this test does is it logs in as an administrative user, it navigates to the site information settings page, and it changes the name of our site. And then it saves the form and verifies that the site name is as expected. Rather than hard coding the name here, let's just generate a random name. And so I'm going to say site name, this, random, we'll get a random string. And we kind of want ours to be 10 characters instead of 8. So I've assigned this to the variable $sitename, and then I'm going to use that variable when assigning the value of sitename when submitting the form. The reason that I've put it in a variable like this is because I want to make sure that I'm storing the randomly generated string so that I can make use of it later when I perform my test to assert that the string was actually used. So like so, down here in testing site name, I might do something like site name. Now if we switch over to our browser and run these tests, we can see that it'll generate a random string, assign it as the site name, and assert that that is the actual site name. Let's try that. So back on our site, I'm going to go to Configuration, Testing, find the Hello World tests. There's just one still, so I'll just check the box for the Hello World group, and click Run Tests, and wait for the tests to complete. Once the tests are complete, we can take a look at the verbose messages that were output by this test. So it logged in as our user, navigated to the form here, let's see, navigated to the form to edit the system site information. So I can see that. I'm on the form. Click Next, you can see it's submitted the form here, and it submitted the form with a random string for the site name, which is what we asked it to do. You can also see right away that after that form was submitted, it's changed the site information variable and that random string is showing up. And on the next page, we're back to the home page and we've run our assertion that, yep, the site name is definitely set to this random string. So we know that that's working. Let's take a look at generating some other content. In order for this test to make sense, I want to walk through what we're going to do in the browser. I want to test some functionality of Drupal's core statistics module. Let's take a look at what that module does. The first thing I'll do on my site is just enable the statistics module, if it's not already enabled. So we'll scroll down, go to modules, scroll down the list, find the statistics module and enable it. Save configuration. Now I'm going to add a piece of content to my site. I'm going to go to add content, add a basic page. We'll call this a test page. And say copy goes here in the body. Leave everything else the defaults, and I'll click Save. Taken back to the page that I just created, and I'm going to hit refresh. Nope, looks like I need to enable some tracking with the statistics module. So the module is turned on, but I need to configure it. So if I go to Configuration and then Statistics, and I can enable access log, and I'm going to say Count Content Views, and save configuration. Close this. Overlay, refresh the page. Now you can see down in the bottom right corner here, it says 1 read. If I refresh it again, it says 2. If I continue to refresh it, that number will keep going up. This is what the statistics module does. So in order to test this, the plan that I need to execute involves, first I need to enable the statistics module. Then I need to configure the statistics module so that statistics tracking is turned on and the little counter shows up in the corner down here. Then I need to create a new node so I can simulate navigating to that page in my browser and clicking refresh a couple of times and ensuring that the counter goes up. Let's take a look at how we would do that in our test case. So I'm going to switch back to my editor. I'm going to add a underscore to our test authorization method, so just so that it skips running it when we're testing the create content one we're about to write. Add a new test create content, remembering to prefix the method name with test. That way SimpleTest will treat it as a set of tests that it should run. And now I'm going to go through all of the things that I need to do. Okay, so the first thing we said we need to do is enable the statistics module. That doesn't happen inside of our test method. That's actually part of the setup method. So I'll scroll back up here. We're already enabling Hello World. Let's also enable like so. So I'm enabling the Hello World module and the statistics module. I also said that one step that we're going to need to do is configure the statistics module. Now, there are a couple of ways we could go about doing this. We could navigate to the statistics configuration form and fill out the form and change the settings. But since that's not what we're not really trying to test the functionality of that form, we could also just use the variable set function provided by the Drupal API and manually set those variables to whatever we want them to be. I'm going to do that inside of my setup method here. So I'm going to add variable_set statistics enable access log and statistics count content views. I'm setting them to on. This is the equivalent of having gone and checked the checkbox, but far fewer steps for the test runner to perform. So this will be more performant. Whenever you manipulate variables inside of a test case, you also need to use the refresh variables method. You need to call this refresh variables. And what this does is update the test case's cached version of all of the variables. So these three lines here are the equivalent of having gone and enabled the statistics tracking on the configuration form for the statistics module. So we did those two steps. The next thing we need to do is actually create a piece of content and go and view it. So down here at the bottom of our hello world.test file, inside of the test create content method, let's go about creating a new node. In order to do that, we need to use this Drupal create node method. So we'll say node equals this Drupal create node. Then we saw that it takes one argument. The argument that we need to pass in here is the settings for our node. What are those settings? It's the values that we want for each of the individual fields and properties of a node. It might look something like this. I'll create a new settings array. We'll say we want a node of type page. That's the default, but just to illustrate how this works, maybe we want to promote it to the home page. We want to set the title to, well, I don't know. We need a string. We could either just add our own string, or we could come up with a random string by using something like this, random name. We'll also want to fill in the body field. It's not required, but I want to illustrate how this works. So the body field of a node is a little bit more complicated. First off, it's a field API field. It's not just a standard entity property. So we need to simulate the structure that you would see in a node object. Ultimately, what we're doing here is we're kind of creating a base node object, passing it into the Drupal create node function, which will then save that object to the database. So the body field on a node, when you're accessing it, usually looks something like this. Body und 0, probably value. And it also contains the format options. So it's this nested array that contains the field information. We need to simulate that here when creating a new node using Drupal create node. So I'll say new array, body is an array. The first key is language none. That's that UND. And that's an array. So this is 0 here. And 0 then is an array as well. And inside of that array, we've got the value, or we could say copy goes here, and the format. The format being which text filter to use with this body field. I'm just going to say filter default format, which will just ask Drupal for whatever the default format setting is. So now when this settings array gets passed to Drupal create node, I expect it to create a new page node with a title that's some random string and the body copy being copy goes here using the default format. It's promoted to the front page. That looks good to me. So that's going to create our node. The nice thing about doing it this way with Drupal create node, rather than going and filling out the form, is we also now know what the node object is. So we'll know the ID of the node that was just created, which means we can really easily navigate to the page to view that node. So I can navigate to that page in my test by doing something like this, Drupal get node in ID. All right, so I've just navigated to that page. Once I'm on the page, I can assert that I'm actually on the right page by saying this assert text title, node title was found. So we're verifying that we're on the right page just by comparing the title of the page that we're viewing to the title of the node that we just created. And then I can view the page a couple of times and see if that assert or the one read, two reads statistic is displayed and goes up. So I might do something like this. So I'm going to view the page a second time. The reason I'm viewing it a second time is that one read statistic doesn't actually show up until the second time you viewed the page, because someone has to have previously viewed it in order for there to be one read. And I'll do this assert text, one read, like so. You know what? I'll just copy this again and do it a second time to confirm that if I view the node a second time, the counter is incremented. One other important thing here is that in order for this one read and two reads to show up, we need to be an authenticated user with permission to view that counter. Right now, all of this is happening as the anonymous user. In a previous lesson, we saw how you can authenticate and authorize a user. What I'm going to do is update our user that we created earlier and give them permission to view these statistics and then log in as that user. If I scroll back up to the setup method where we're creating our admin user, we've got this Drupal create user. They're going to administer site configuration permission. I'm also going to give them access content so they can view the content that we just created and view post access counter permissions. So our admin user now has this whole set of permissions. Down in our test method that we just created, I now need to log in as that user. So I'll just go ahead and add that right at the top here. It doesn't really matter as long as I do it before I get to this one read step, but to keep things tidy, we'll just say Drupal login this admin user. So that should work. Let's go run this test and see what happens. Back in my browser, I can go to Configuration, Testing, find the Hello World test in the list and click the checkbox for Hello World group. We'll run that whole group of tests because it's really just our one, and then click the Run Tests button and wait for SimpleTest to do its thing. What SimpleTest is doing right now is setting up an environment that has the statistics module enabled, then logging in as the admin user with the set of permissions that we just defined, configuring the statistics module by simulating checking those two checkboxes, and then creating a node and viewing the node a couple of times to test the counter. It looks like all of our tests pass. That's awesome. If you click this Hello World open, you can take a look at what it's done. We've seen this part before where it creates the user and logs in as that user. Here's where it's created our node. So it's just logged in as this new user. I can go next. It's just created our node and gone and viewed the node for the first time. It's verifying that the title is that random string. There is no one read yet, but if I go to the next page, this is the second time we viewed it, so there's one read. This is the third time we viewed the same page, so there's two reads, and that's the end of our test suite there. So that worked out well. Just to recap what we did and what we kind of looked at here, the most important bits were the random string, random name, and Drupal create node methods that we're using inside of our tests. I'm going to take a look at the code again. This random name and this random string are great if we need to just generate some random bits of content to create a new user or as the title of a page or wherever you just might need something random within the test. Sometimes we need more structured content though, like a node. The DrupalWebTestCase provides us with the Drupal create node method, which helps make it easier to create nodes. We set one up here by creating a settings array that we pass in that defines the properties and field values. We created a page node. I could just as easily change this to say article and create an article node, or I could create a new node type and then create a node of that type. Be aware when creating nodes that if you're dealing with fields on the node, you need to format the value in this settings array just as you would with the node if you were calling, say, node save. A really good way to figure out what values or what structure this should be is to actually go to your site, log in and create a node, and use a module like devel, which has the preview of what this node object looks like, and inspect that. Or just write some code that does a var dump on a node object to see how Drupal handles that, and then simulate that structure inside of your test. So that's creating random content inside of SimpleTest.